talk about a topic. I'm always happy to talk about a topic that is really very fascinating to me, and that's the life of Johnston Pettigrew. Now, Pettigrew is going to only really make brief appearances in the Shenandoah Valley. The only time that he will ever be in the Shenandoah Valley is really in the lead up to Gettysburg and the retreat from Gettysburg. Um, but he lives one of the more interesting and fascinating lives of any Civil War figure that you will find. And so, what I thought, we spend so much time looking at what these men do during the war. What did they do before? What brought them to these points? And I think Pettigrew has a very fascinating life that we'll delve into here in the next hour or so as we look at his life. Now, Pettigrew was born on July 4th, 1828, near Lake Phelps in Terrell County, North Carolina. And if this works, I can show you where Terrell County is. Let's see. There we go. It's that red outline. You'll see it's in the northeastern part of the state. Now, his father was from a wealthy family. They're actually a French background. And the Pettigrew family actually has two different spellings. The North Carolina family would spell it with the end of it being Grew. The South Carolinians, Gru. So that's how you can always tell for the Pettigrews. They're from North Carolina or South Carolina. Same family, just different spellings of their name depending on which state they were in. Now, he was born to Ebenezer and Anne Shepherd Pettigrew. His father, as I said, was a wealthy individual of French descent. According to some sources, his mother and the mother of future Union General John Gibbon were first cousins, making Gibbon and Pettigrew second cousins. There's still a little bit of challenge trying to kind of put that together. You'll see it sometimes published in a lot of works. But what we have is at one point, they were actually talking with each other before the Civil War when both were in Charleston, South Carolina. Never mentioned they were cousins. So whether it was just something they didn't mention or they didn't know, it's still a bit of a mystery about his life. Now, the first 7 years of Pettigrew's life, he will live at one of the family's three plantations that were around Lake Phelps. This is Somerset Plantation. This is one of those. And at the time of 7 years old, though, he is going to be sent to New Bern, North Carolina. He'll be sent there to continue his education. From the very beginning, Johnston Pettigrew was marked as a child of a lot of promise. He was certainly heads and above his peers in intelligence, and that created a bit of a tough life for him. Also, in his early years, he was often sick in what he referred to as an unfortunate exposure that led to an unknown ailment that he had. He'll receive his preliminary education in New Bern, and immediately they saw this is a kid of a lot of promise. This is a magnificent mind that he has. At the age of 4, his uncle will note that if his health would hold out and he received adequate schooling, in his uncle's words, he will become an extraordinary man. Another family member described Johnston Pettigrew as a child as simply a genius. Between the ages of 7 and 14, Pettigrew alternated living in his family's plantations with relatives in Raleigh and eventually to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where he began his formal education. And he attended Bingham's Academy, one of the finest private schools in the state of North Carolina at the time. In many ways, it was a preparatory school for the University of North Carolina. Others would go to schools such as Harvard, Yale, other schools, University of Virginia, but primarily it was a prep school for the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Now, as he attended this, he had all the advantages. His family was incredibly wealthy, so they could give him the best education possible, but he appears to have had a very unhappy childhood. He does not write a lot about his childhood. And I can imagine when you're a kid of that promise, you don't get to be a normal kid. Everybody's fawning over you. Everybody expects these great things. They don't just let you be a kid. And Pettigrew will later note in his words to his brother, he said, and I quote, "Childhood and boyhood up to my 19th year was detestable, and I never look back to them but with disgust." That's how he sums up his childhood. But through that childhood, he's getting a good educational basis. After Bingham's Academy, he will attend the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill that you will see. This image is about as close as what you're going to find to an image of what the campus looked like when Pettigrew was there. It has since expanded quite a bit, but this is about as close. This image is actually from the 1870s, but the campus had not changed very much from when Pettigrew was there to what you see today. Now, while at the University of North Carolina, he excelled in mathematics and classical languages. He was also a member of a number of debating societies, educational societies, and the such. This was someone that really took advantage of his time in college. He also led his class, interestingly enough, in fencing and boxing. So not only is he smart, he could probably handle himself pretty well in a scrap if necessary. Pettigrew will receive a mark of excellence in literally every subject for 4 years, and he graduated as the valedictorian at UNC in 1847. Now, attending the commencement that year was President James K. Polk, likewise a graduate of the University of North Carolina, who was clearly impressed by the valedictorian that day and the address that he gave. He was soon appointed by Polk as a professor at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. So already he's being marked for great things in his life. And you'll see an image of the United States Naval Observatory here as it would have appeared in the 19th century. While he's at the Naval Observatory, he's going to get to know the famed oceanographer Matthew Fontaine Maury. Pettigrew, though, will leave after 6 months to study the law, but by all accounts, he was incredible at this work. He helped chart ocean currents. A lot of really cutting edge research at this time was being done by the United States Naval Observatory. And for at least 6 months, Pettigrew was involved with some of that. And I think it shows you the breadth of his intellect. This is someone that speaks multiple languages. Some accounts say he can speak 5 languages, others say he can speak 7, or he can speak 5 and can read 2 others, but an incredibly, really flexible mind that whatever he wants to learn, he's going to be able to learn and excel at it. After his 6-month stint at the United States Naval Observatory, he is going to then move to Baltimore, Maryland. You'll see a picture of Pettigrew when he is in his 20s. Here. So you'll see a dashing young individual. So he'll study law in Baltimore, and then he'll set off to Europe. And this is one thing that's going to really mark his life. For a lot of the 1850s, he's traveling abroad. So he's not like a lot of Southerners that are more insular. He's seen the world. He's not only seen the North, he's seen the large cities of Europe, and he will spend quite a bit of time traveling throughout Europe. He will also attend classes at the University of Berlin. So from January 1850 to August of 1852, he was in Europe. He studied at the University of Berlin and traveled over most of Western Europe, visiting on foot and on horseback many regions that were not always visited by tourists. One thing that I think Pettigrew really enjoyed was these travels. I think he liked being exposed to different cultures, different places, and learning about them. It will certainly be a recurring theme in his life. During the course of his travels, though, he's going to develop a really almost deep identification with Europe, and especially and particularly with Italians and Spaniards. He spent a lot of time in Italy and Spain during his course. Now, while in Europe, he learned to speak and write French, Spanish, German, and Italian, and he could read Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. He also taught himself with the intention of trying to write a history of the Spanish Moors, which he never accomplished. But this shows that his mind is a remarkable one at that. Pettigrew's European study was subsidized by James C. Johnston, a friend of his father who was very wealthy and who Johnston was named for. So this is someone that more or less bankrolled Johnston Pettigrew's not only his education, but his travels to Europe, really sort of an investment into this bright young man. On his return from Europe, Pettigrew is going to be made a junior law partner of a family member by the name of James Lewis Pettigrew. This is a Pettigrew with GRU, a South Carolinian, who was Ebenezer Pettigrew's first cousin and one of the leading attorneys in the country. And what was interesting is one of the most notable Union men in South Carolina. When South Carolina secedes in December of 1860, it is James Lewis Pettigrew who will give one of the greatest quotes of the American Civil War. South Carolina is too small for a republic, too large for an insane asylum. Still holds today. So what we'll see is Pettigrew is going to attend the law there. From 1852 to 1861, Pettigrew was a resident of Charleston, South Carolina. He also, through his connections with James Lewis Pettigrew, he got to know many of the prominent families in Charleston. He mingled with a lot of them. He took part in social activities. He was one of the leading attorneys in the county, and he was noted for his intellectual pursuits and what they called his romantic temperament. I do not know what that means, but that's what they said. From so we'll see a contemporary at this time described him as slender, fair complexioned, with piercing eyes and a conspicuously high forehead. Another noted Pettigrew was modest to a fault, which is kind of interesting for someone with this level of skill, this talent. You could have a very healthy ego. By all accounts, Pettigrew does not. I think Pettigrew, if anything, really wanted normalcy in his life. I think Pettigrew would love nothing more than just be a regular kind of face in the crowd, not one that had all these high hopes pinned on him. But this was the life he was given. Now, Pettigrew never married, although he was linked by matchmakers to a number of notable South Carolina ladies at various times, but clearly nothing ever developed beyond that. He was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1856, where Pettigrew rendered really his most notable service in his presentation of a minority report that marshaled the arguments against reopening the foreign slave trade. That does not go over well in South Carolina. So this shows Pettigrew is okay taking different positions than others. And I think he's certainly influenced by James Lewis Pettigrew and his unionist bent. Pettigrew is not an artist secessionist. He's not going to be a fire eater, even though he's right in the heart of it in Charleston, South Carolina. I think that more worldly view that he has gave him an insight that maybe other Southerners did not have of this era. Now, the report attracted national attention. And together with Pettigrew's role as actually a second in a duel, which killed a popular young newspaper editor, it really led to his political defeat 2 years later. So he had a very brief time in politics. But as I said, he was never an enthusiastic secessionist. Pettigrew, though, had nevertheless become convinced through his association with individuals from Massachusetts and other northern states that he had met that the Civil War in America was inevitable, despite his greatest fears. He also believed that the war would be a long, massive, desperate affair, not the short, decisive campaign that was commonly expected. To prepare himself for this, though, he took an active part in militia activities in South Carolina throughout the 1850s. In 1859, when war breaks out in Italy against the Austrians, Pettigrew is going to go to Europe once again. He is looking to join the Italians in this fight for liberty and experience war firsthand. Unfortunately, he gets there and the hostilities have ceased. But it's during this time that he's going to be studying tactics and logistics with French officers. And after returning to Charleston, he's going to become in demand as an instructor for numerous active militia companies formed there in the months preceding the Civil War. So even though he is not a professional soldier, he has a really good background in military affairs. And we'll see that playing a role in his later activities in the Civil War. We'll also see a image of Spain here from his time. As a result of his second trip to Europe, he is going to write a book entitled Notes on Spain and the Spaniards in the Summer of 1859 with a Glance at Sardinia. As I say, he's not maybe the best in short, pithy titles, but it works. So the book is going to be published in 1861. The problem, though, is when it gets published, it's right during the Fort Sumter crisis. No one is paying any attention about a travelogue about Spain. They're focused about the events happening in their very harbor at this moment. But even though it did not attract a lot of attention at the time, it has later received quite a bit of praise. It is a very, I think, objective view of Spain at the time and really a great travelogue for the era, which I mean, how many firsthand accounts do we have of what Spain was like to a traveler in the 1850s? Pettigrew gives us one of those. So it still has importance today for scholars of Spain, even to this day. One reviewer described it as interesting a volume of its kind as one can well imagine. The book is pretty much a travel account. It also explores Spanish history and a defense of the Spanish people against what were, in many areas, cultural and racial prejudices against them. It exhibits an intimate knowledge of life of all classes. He's not just hanging with the wealthy. He is spending times at all levels of Spanish society. And he also has a capacity for humor. There's a number of interesting and funny stories that he includes, but he also has a profound sympathy for not only the Spanish temperament, but also their traditions, which he in many ways sort of felt comfortable with. Some of these sort of cooked in traditions these countries have, not that much different than what he would have experienced growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, with their sort of set traditions and ways. Many of the Spanish characteristics that he celebrated: individualism, personal pride, democratic manners, loyalty, devoutness, disdain for capitalist and utilitarian values that were not irrelevant, that were irrelevant to what he perceived to be the virtues of the southern states, in contrast to those of northern states, Great Britain and Germany. So he sort of sees the Spanish as sort of kindred spirits of the South. We have an image here of Fort Sumter. He will return in 1860 to South Carolina. And during the secession crisis, the governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens, is going to appoint him as his chief military aide. This is a guy that has no military background beyond what he's learned on his own. So clearly Pettigrew cuts an impressive figure to the governor. It will be Pettigrew who, early on the morning of December 27th, 1860, personally delivers a message from the governor of South Carolina to the Union commander of that post, Major Robert Anderson. That same day, Pettigrew occupied the abandoned Castle Pinckney, and he remained on duty with forces in Charleston Harbor until the surrender of Fort Sumter in April of 1861. He actually will watch the bombardment of this fort on April 12th, 1861. After Fort Sumter, Pettigrew will join the famed Hampton Legion, then being raised in South Carolina by Wade Hampton, as a private. That's pretty remarkable. That he is looking to serve at the very base. I think that sort of goes to my theory of him, that he sort of wanted just normalcy here. The problem, though, is his reputation has preceded him. He is not going to remain a private for long. In fact, he is going to be elected colonel of the 22nd North Carolina in August of 1861. He's known as one of the brightest minds that North Carolina has ever produced, and the men of the 22nd North Carolina would love to have him as their colonel. So this is now what's going to have him leave Charleston, South Carolina, and make his way back to his home of North Carolina. Pettigrew will then arrive in Richmond, Virginia with his regiment, and he is soon joined by a friend from Charleston by the name of Lewis Young, who would become Pettigrew's most loyal friend and the most trusted member of his staff. It's also Lewis Young that we owe a debt of gratitude for. A lot of what we know about Pettigrew's activity at the Battle of Gettysburg and in the retreat is because of Lewis Young. Pettigrew will not survive the Gettysburg campaign, but Young will write a number of articles and letters during the war and after the war, really praising the life of Johnston Pettigrew, his good friend. While in Virginia, Colonel Pettigrew planned and constructed a number of river batteries along the Potomac. He was soon recommended to General Joseph Johnston for promotion to brigadier general. Despite the recommendation, Pettigrew actually declines the promotion on account of what he said was his lack of military experience. And then in his opinion, he didn't earn it. So how many people in the Civil War do you see turning down being a brigadier general? I mean, think about how many people were clamoring over each other to get those positions. Here's Pettigrew willingly turning it down because he feels he didn't earn it. I think this gives a lot to the character of Johnston Pettigrew. Despite the, as I said, despite the recommendation, he declines that. One of his acquaintances was the famed diarist Mary Chesnut. Mary Chesnut will actually criticize Pettigrew. She will describe him as being too high and mighty to accept preferential treatment in his career. Eventually, though, Pettigrew gives in. He is soon going to accept the promotion in March of 1862. He was given command of a brigade, which consisted of the 22nd North Carolina, his old regiment, the 2nd Arkansas Battalion, the 35th Georgia, and the 47th Virginia. This is back early in the war when you had states being mingled all the way in Confederate brigades. By the time of the Gettysburg campaign, you see a lot more standardization. North Carolina troops and North Carolina brigades, Virginia troops and Virginia brigades, so on and so forth. But early in the war, you were just sort of brigading these troops as much as they could. And this actually at times caused a bit of challenges. These soldiers from different states didn't always play well with each other. So Pettigrew not only had to deal with the day-to-day challenges of being a colonel and brigadier general, but also dealing with these different constituencies that he will have in his brigade. Pettigrew set to work very quickly, getting his brigade ready through rigorous training. One staff member noted that General Pettigrew, in his words, knew everything about it and is teaching the brigade very fast. So this is a soldier that is very much wanting to have discipline and a well-drilled brigade. That is going to be a hallmark of his career. This is his first brigade. His second brigade, that he's more famous for, his North Carolina Brigade, will certainly be an incredibly well drilled and disciplined brigade by the time they enter Gettysburg. At this point, a young relative requested, in their words, a safe place on General Pettigrew's staff. Pettigrew's response: I assume you that the most unsafe place in the brigade is about me. By all means, let him get rid of this idea of a safe place. He will regret it after time. The post of danger is certainly the post of honor. So this is a man that's going to lead from the front. As we will see, it's ultimately going to cause him not only a severe wound at the Battle of Seven Pines, but ultimately a mortal wounding at Falling Waters. Pettigrew's first campaign as a brigade commander is nearly his last. Around dusk on May 31st, 1862, at the Battle of Seven Pines, Pettigrew's brigade encountered a Union brigade under Willis Gorman, who was part of a Second Corps division under John Sedgwick. Previous Confederate attacks have been unable to dislodge Union forces from a strong position that they held. It was also very confused actions, and very dense woods, swamps, and such broke up these attacks. So Pettigrew moved ahead of his troops to determine the exact position of these Union forces. He did this alone, as his staff was still behind, getting the troops up onto the front. Soon as he's doing this, a mini ball will tear through Pettigrew's throat into his shoulder. Due to blood loss and exhaustion, Pettigrew soon falls to the ground. Several of the men of the brigade will find him. They attempt to carry him off the field, but Pettigrew orders them back into line. Don't worry about me. Get back to your duty. Many in the brigade thought the commander was dying, as his eyes were fixed, and one described him as being nearly insensible at this time. Certainly the shock, blood loss, other things are going to cause you to be in that state. The brigade was soon driven back, and Pettigrew was now in territory occupied by Union troops. His friend Lewis Young attempted to rally a group of soldiers from the brigade to make a raid into the woods to rescue Pettigrew. But in his words, they could not stand up to the terrific storm of shot and shell which swept the woods and all the practical approaches to it. The only option left was to ask to search the woods under a flag of truce. But Pettigrew had earlier told Young that it was not proper, in his words. He did not want intercourse of this kind, should any ever be had, with such an enemy that we are at war with now. Young is going to assume that Pettigrew is dead. In fact, he's going to write a letter to to Johnston Pettigrew's brother 2 days later, and he will write, "But in saying this, my heart bleeds, and I feel that I need more consolation than I can possibly give. I loved him with an earnestness of strength which I cannot express." According to another staff officer, Peter, Pettigrew's slave, was inconsolable over the loss of Pettigrew. Peter noted, "It is very strange they could save themselves, but not their general." Young later will write to his mother, "I have lost one of my most loved friends, gladly would have given my life for his. You cannot tell how I grieve his loss." But as we know, Pettigrew survives. His nearly fatal wound was bandaged by Colonel Augustus Ball of the 35th Georgia just in the nick of time. Pettigrew later would, as I said, would later be hit in his left shoulder by a spent round and was actually bayoneted in the leg as Union troops passed over the area. He was taken to the rear as a prisoner the next morning. The ball that hit him entered the lower part of his throat, struck his windpipe, and passed beneath his collarbone to exit from the top of his right shoulder. As it did, it cut an artery on the way out. Pettigrew should have been killed. There's no other way around it. This should be a mortal wound, but he survives. But he's going to live with a severe disability for the rest of his life. His right arm will never work the way he wants, and he'll be really in chronic pain for the rest of his days on this earth. For 2 weeks, he was treated at the home of Dr. William Gaines. That is, of course, the namesake of Gaines's Mill, the famous battle that we will know in the 7 days. There, a number of Union officers visited Pettigrew from time to time, and he greeted these visitors openly, but he only had one condition. We can talk about anything as long as no one brings up the subject of politics. Pettigrew's a pretty wise guy. I think we could all agree with that sentiment today. I think we would all get along much better if we followed Pettigrew's advice. So he will be there for 2 weeks, but then eventually Pettigrew is transferred to Fort Delaware. where he will remain as a prisoner of war. What you're looking at right now is an image of the entryway to Fort Delaware, and you'll actually see the arrival of 2,000 Vicksburg prisoners at Fort Delaware. This is what's happening around this time 161 years ago, as part of that Vicksburg garrison is being sent to various prisons throughout the North. This is where Pettigrew will stay. Pettigrew's staff will learn of his survival on June 4th. One member of the staff wrote that the general, if he had been able, and his mind would have never been taken. Pettigrew was exchanged, though, on August 6th, in large part because of the condition that he was in. But Pettigrew was quite bitter over the treatment that he received at Fort Delaware. He is going to write that he noted the officers of McClellan's army were, in his words, generally gentlemen and treated him well. The same cannot be said at Fort Delaware. And he would write that they had offended all of his sensibilities by refusing to parole him immediately and locking him in a cell. Worse still, the surgeon had admitted that he was incapable of treating Pettigrew's wound properly. And in Pettigrew's words, it had not been dressed during his entire stay at Fort Delaware. When Pettigrew returned to duty, he was expected to resume command of his old brigade. But just a little problem. As he leaves that brigade, the next officer up was the colonel of the 22nd North Carolina, William Dorsey Pender. Of course, Pender is going to become one of the rising stars in the Army of Northern Virginia. He is going to run with this brigade and take it to great heights as a famed member of the Light Division under A.P. Hill in 1862 and parts of 1863. Of course, he will not be out of a job for long. At this moment, there is a North Carolina brigade being formed. So we will see now southwestern Virginia, eastern North Carolina, where Pettigrew is going to be spending much of the rest of 1862 and early 1863. Now, the brigade that Pettigrew is going to receive consisted of the 11th, the 26th, the 44th, the 47th, and the 52nd North Carolina. This will be their composition in the Gettysburg campaign, minus the 44th North Carolina, which was back held at Hanover Courthouse, Hanover Junction, to guard the rail lines there. Now, initially, this brigade was commanded by Brigadier General James Green Martin, and at one point had the 17th, the 44th, the 47th, the 52nd North Carolina. There's going to be some reshuffling. Martin left as a commander to get the role as the adjutant general of the state of North Carolina. As Martin departed, he took the 17th North Carolina with him. It was commanded by his brother. This created an opening for a new commander and a regiment to join the brigade. Interestingly enough, General James Martin in the 17th North Carolina will take part in a little battle known as the Battle of Newport Barracks on February 2nd, 1864, and some guy wrote a book about that. You might want to check it out sometime. So what we'll see is that Pettigrew takes command, and soon the 26th North Carolina joins. Of course, the 26th North Carolina will really be the stalwart regiment in this brigade. It was a more experienced regiment than these other units, and it was also going to be the largest regiment in the brigade. Entering the Gettysburg campaign, the 26th North Carolina has over 900 men in the ranks, one of the largest regiments north or south in the Gettysburg campaign. By December, the 11th North Carolina will join. And this will be now sort of the composition they will hold all the way until Appomattox Courthouse at the end of the war. Now, the service in eastern North Carolina, the brigade was really created by Martin, but it was molded by Pettigrew. A lot of this service in eastern North Carolina was not really active campaigning, but it is a lot of marching. It's a lot of garrison duty. It's a lot of moving back and forth, and it also gave them a lot of time to drill. And as we look at his brigade's performance in the Gettysburg campaign, they perform incredibly well for being more or less an unexperienced brigade. I have to think, though, this time spent in southeastern Virginia, eastern North Carolina certainly helped mold them into the brigade that they will become. In May of 1863, the brigade is ordered to join the Army of Northern Virginia. It is soon assigned to the division of Henry Heath in the newly created Confederate Third Corps under the command of Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. At the request of as the rest of the brigade begins to move north, as I said, the 44th North Carolina is ordered to remain to guard the railroad at Hanover Junction near Ashland, Virginia. And the 44th North Carolina will see a sharp skirmish with Union troops there on June 26, 1863. Of course, at this point, Pettigrew and his brigade are heading north. We're not really going to go into the details of what they do in the Battle of Gettysburg, but they will see in heavy action the brigade on July 1st and July 3rd. The total brigade strength when they enter the Battle of Gettysburg is around 2,800, one of the larger brigades in Lee's army. they will lose 1,753 of those engaged at Gettysburg. That is roughly over a 60% loss of the brigade, one of the highest losses you will see of a brigade anywhere in the Confederate Army here at Gettysburg. Henry Heath will report that the brigade fought as well and displayed as heroic a courage as it was ever my fortune to witness on a battlefield. Lewis Young of the brigade's staff noted the fighting was the deadliest he had ever witnessed in the war. Now, at Gettysburg, Pettigrew will enter as a brigade commander, but on the afternoon of July 1st, Major General Henry Heath is wounded in the head by a spent round. He's severely concussed. As the ranking brigade commander, Johnston Pettigrew will now command the division on July 3rd. And as some like to call it, it is not just Pickett's charge, but the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble assault. He will be one of the 3 division commanders in that attack. Of course, as we know, that attack on July 3rd, 1863 will fail. During that attack, Pettigrew is actually severely wounded in his right hand as he was crossing the Emmitsburg Road. So this is a division commander that is right up in the thick of the fight. In fact, he was one of the very last officers of his division to fall back, and he worked tirelessly to reform his brigade. Of course, he noticed, and he will say that at the end of the night of July 3rd, my brigade formed a pretty decent skirmish line. This brigade has been absolutely ravaged. To give you a sense of the loss in Pettigrew's brigade, the ranking officer in the brigade at this moment on the afternoon of July 3rd after Pickett's charge was Major John Jones of the 26th North Carolina. On July 1st, Jones is the 3rd ranking officer in his regiment. He is the only field officer left in the brigade as it leaves Gettysburg. So in this period between July 5th into July 14th, Battle of Falling Waters, Pettigrew will bounce back and forth from brigade command to division command, depending on the condition of Henry Heath. If you've ever had a head injury or ever had a concussion, you know you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. And Pettigrew will be bouncing back and forth at times. But by all accounts, manages it pretty well. And I think it shows that he would have had he survived, perhaps an aptitude for certainly brigade command, as well as division command. As we look at the Confederate Army, late 1863, 1864, experienced, qualified brigade commanders and division commanders were hard pressed to find at this point. Of course, Lee's army will make it to the Potomac River. Now, after retreating from Gettysburg after his defeat there, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate infantry and his artillery, as well as his cavalry, is going to reach the Potomac River at the fords along at Williamsport, as well as Falling Waters, Maryland. They're going to arrive, depending on the time, between July 8th and July 9th. Now, when Lee's men reach the Potomac River, it was flooded by really a week of torrential rains off and on. The problem is you cannot put your pontoon bridges across if that river is at flood stage. It's too dangerous. You can't guarantee they will stay moored to their anchorages. So what you will see is the Confederates now dig in. They are waiting for the river to recede. On July 11th, Lee is going to begin to entrench his line at both river crossings as he waited for General George Meade's army to attack. On July 12th, Meade is going to reach the vicinity, and he's going to probe the Confederate position. Skirmishing was heavy along this line from Williamsport to Falling Waters as Meade readied for a potential attack. On the evening of the 12th, Meade is going to hold a council of war. It's at this where he has all of his corps commanders, and he asks them, should we make this attack? His corps commanders advised him against moving against Lee's formidable defenses. And keep in mind, even though the Union Army is victorious at Gettysburg, they suffer heavy losses here, not only in rank and file soldiers, but also in leadership. John Reynolds is dead. Winfield Scott Hancock is severely wounded. More importantly, Dan Sickles is out of the picture as well. How will the Army function without Dan Sickles? I'm just kidding about that. The loss of Hancock and Reynolds, much, much severe loss here. So what we will see is by the 12th and 13th, the Union Army is debating what to do. That Potomac River is going to begin to recede. By the evening of July 13th, you are now going to have the river low enough to be able to cross those pontoons. And what you'll begin to see is on the evening of July 13th, the Army in Northern Virginia moving across the Potomac back into West Virginia and then Virginia itself. Of course, there are some troops left behind. In this case, it is the division of Henry Heath. They are the rear guard of Lee's army at this point. And on the morning of July 14th, 1863, Judson Kilpatrick and John Buford's cavalry divisions are approaching from the north and the east. Before allowing Buford's men to gain a position on the flank and rear of Heath's division, Kilpatrick attacked the rear guard division straight ahead. Now, at this moment, when these troopers are charging towards the Confederate lines, there had been reports that Jeb Stuart's troopers would be moving towards them. And what these men in the ranks saw initially were Union battle flags and cavalry guidons, but they thought it was just Jeb Stuart's troopers showboating, showing the prize that they had captured in a skirmish. It was not until they heard the order to charge and men of the 6th Michigan Cavalry began to pour into their ranks, they realized the danger that they are in. What we will see is Henry Heath moves to the rear to begin to command his brigade or his division, but Pettigrew launches right into the fight. One soldier will remember that he was on foot for this entire time, directing soldiers wherever he saw them, getting them in line, putting them where they need to be, leading from the front. It's at this moment, though, in this swirling, confused fight, that as Pettigrew is directing his soldiers, if we look at the house here, you'll see the fleeing Confederates, you'll see the Union cavalry here, you'll see the barn, and you'll see what is called the Donnelly House. The house is still standing today, the barn is not. But most of the accounts we have place Pettigrew between the house and the barn when he is going to be mortally wounded. He will be shot by a Union cavalryman in his abdomen as he was attempting to get his pistol ready to shoot him. Of course, keep in mind the issues that Pettigrew had with his shoulder. He also had his right hand had a bullet through it earlier. So he's really fumbling to try to get that. Unfortunately, the Union trooper drew quicker. He is now mortally wounded. Initially, Pettigrew was taken to the Donnelly house, and the expectation was that they were going to leave him there. It's too dangerous to try to move him. Hopefully, if Union troops come in, they can give him some care. Pettigrew refused to remain in the house. Think about his experience as a prisoner of war the previous year. It was not a fun experience. Pettigrew likely knows, being wounded in the abdomen also, this is a mortal wound. He probably has very little time left on this earth. And if that's the case, he does not want to die in the hands of Union forces. So what he will do is order men to then take him down to the river. Now, keep in mind, when you're at Falling Waters, it's about 3/4 to a mile or more back to points of the Potomac River they'll be crossing. So they carried him out by stretcher. He will then cross the Potomac with the rest of his brigade. But in this fight at Falling Waters, almost 500 of his brigade were captured by the divisions of John Buford and Judson Kilpatrick. But the rest of Lee's army is able to escape. They are now across the Potomac River. At this moment, as he's carried across the river, he will soon be taken to Bunker Hill, West Virginia, where he will stay at the Edgewood Manor Plantation, also known as the John Boyd House. It is still standing today. I took this photo a couple years ago. It's in private hands, but you can still see it to this day. Unfortunately, on July 17th, 3 days after his wounding, Pettigrew succumbs to his wounds. Of course, 161 years ago yesterday, Pettigrew will pass away. The loss of Pettigrew absolutely devastated his home state and his troops as well. Later, the state of North Carolina is going to erect a monument to Pettigrew along Route 11 there. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, a driver driving a truck had a seizure, lost control of their vehicle, and slammed into that monument. So the monument is not really in the condition it should be to this day. Unfortunately, it was damaged in that automobile wreck. But this gives you a sense of how well regarded Pettigrew was, not only after the war, but during the war as well. Governor Zebulon Vance of North Carolina is actually going to order an official day of mourning in the state of North Carolina to be held in his honor. Pettigrew's body is taken from Bunker Hill, West Virginia, back to Raleigh, North Carolina, where it laid in state at the state capitol. Pettigrew, though, will eventually be buried at his family's property in Terrell County. So you'll see a beautiful painting of Pettigrew. And this is actually the painting that they have is a large oil painting. It's actually in the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina. So a really wonderful image of what Pettigrew would have looked like in 1863. You'll also see beside it his grave. Today, it's part of Pettigrew State Park, which you can visit. Now, if you want to go to his grave, it's a bit of a hike. You're going to be crossing over swamps and all kinds of things. So if you really want to visit his grave, it's worth the trek, even if you have to, wait for the alligators and water moccasins to leave off of things too. But it's kind of, hey, sometimes you got to go to a swamp to get the image that you want. Pettigrew's high intellect and his personality really made a deep impression on everybody who he met. Matthew Mowry called him, in his words, the most promising young man in the South. James Lewis Pettigrew spoke of his intellect, in his words, greater than that of John C. Calhoun. Now, despite what we think about John Calhoun's political stances, you cannot deny the man's intellect. He was one of the towering minds in the antebellum era. So for Pettigrew to be compared to him and to even surpass him is high praise. Of course, it should note that his relative was not a fan of John C. Calhoun. So I don't know if that's more of a knock on Calhoun as it is a praise of Pettigrew. We will never truly know. The English-born Colonel Collett Leaventhorpe of the 11th North Carolina served in Pettigrew's brigade and remembered that he never met, in his words, a man who fitted more entirely my beau ideal of the patriot, the soldier, the man of genius, and the accomplished gentleman. Robert E. Lee will remark, the Army has lost a brave soldier, and the Confederacy an accomplished officer. But I think Douglas Southall Freeman says it best in his brief vignette of Pettigrew's life in his acclaimed work, Lee's Lieutenants, which is, in my opinion, still one of the finest works ever written on the Army of Northern Virginia, still in existence. If you want to understand the command of that Army, you will have to spend time with Mr. Freeman and his work. Freeman's going to write that no officer who served in the Army in Northern Virginia so briefly were there so many praises while living and so many laments while dead. I think that sums up the life of Johnston Pettigrew pretty accurately. So with that, that's the life of Johnston Pettigrew. So we'll do now any questions you have. Happy to answer them for you, and we'll go from there. So I guess we'll see those are in the chats here. So if you have any questions, just post them there. Or if you want to chime in as well, that's fine too. I just don't want it to become mass chaos here. All right. So the first question, are there any plans to replace the destroyed monument? I have not heard of any. The challenge we have is that monument was placed by the Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1920s. It's very similar to the markers that you will see even at, out on the entryway to Belle Grove Plantation at Cedar Creek for Stephen Ramser. So the question is, who really controls it? The Daughters of the Confederacy put it here with funding from the state of North Carolina, but it's technically not a North Carolina state monument. So the biggest issue right now is who really controls it, who really has the authority. But I agree that there should be a monument to him there. Hopefully things will be done to rebuild it, but I've not heard of any efforts right now. Not saying they're not, but I have not heard of any. Best book about him. The best book is written by Clyde Wilson. It was called The Carolina Cavalier, The Life of Johnston Pettigrew. It's really the only full-length biography we have of him, but Pettigrew is certainly, I think, due a reevaluation. One of the issues with Wilson's biography is that Wilson doesn't really give as much attention to his military career as he does his pre-war career. And I think certainly a more well-rounded biography could be there. I have toyed with the idea myself at times, but you know, I still gotta get the 26 North Carolina finished. So, and I also prefer podcasting to writing. So we'll see. But if anybody's going to do it, I guess it may be me. So hopefully it'll be half as good as the books that General Pettigrew wrote himself. So do we have any other questions?
Eric, one thing too, I don't know if you've noticed too, recently we've partnered with the Berkeley County Parks and or Berkeley County Historical, and then I think the County of Berkeley County for a new park there just at Falling Waters. Mm-hmm. So maybe that might lead into some conversations about the monument marker.
Well, it creates a little bit of confusion. That's also called Hoax Run.
Run, yeah.
There are actually two Falling Waters here. That adds a little bit of confusion, but certainly that confusion will help, because if you're looking at the 1861 battle, you might stumble into the 1863 battle and vice versa. And anything that I think will bring attention is worthwhile. And really, as we think about the Gettysburg historiography, there is still a lot of glaring areas of the retreat that I think could be covered. Certainly, we have wonderful books such as One Continuous Fight by Eric Wittenberg, J.D. Petruzzi, Mike Nugent, a really great sort of military history of it. I would also recommend Kent Masterson Brown's Lee's Retreat. That's more of a logistics study. Those two, along with Kent Masterson Brown, his recent book on George Meade, are really our best subjects on the retreat, but you could have ample number of books written on some of these small skirmishes on the way there and the overall retreat. I think it's the one area of the Gettysburg campaign that we can still unearth a lot of information on. The battle has been picked over enough. I think now what we're seeing is scholars tending to look at the the days before the battle in the campaign, also the days after. As I always say, the Battle of Gettysburg is 3 days in a 2 month military campaign. And certainly Pettigrew's contributions in the retreat it certainly deserves to be remembered. And as we'll see to the very end, he is a fighting general to the last. All right. Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, if that is it, I want to thank you all. It has been my pleasure to spend the evening with you here from Gettysburg. Uh, I will say I had a 2 hour car tour this morning. I had a 2 hour bus tour in the afternoon. So this is now my 5th hour of talking today. So I am glad to give my voice a rest, but it was a pleasure spending this evening with you. Certainly, I applaud the efforts of what you all do. The Shenandoah Valley has a very special place in my heart. It is one of my favorite places to give tours. It is certainly an area that deserves to be preserved. And Pettigrew, of course, plays a small but important role in the history of the Shenandoah Valley and the general area that surrounds it. So once again, it has been my pleasure. And I hope to see you all either here in Gettysburg or occasionally when I'm doing tours at Cedar Creek and other battlefields in the Valley. So hope to see you all. And once again, thank you for all the work that you do to help preserve our history in the Shenandoah Valley.
Thank you again, Eric. I really appreciate you taking time out tonight to come be with us. It really means a lot to us. And if nobody has any questions, we can wrap this up. And I did see a question too about the recordings. I've recorded it to the cloud here, and I will get with Kevin and Dan here soon to see how we can send that out maybe and view this. If anybody else has any interest, that they know somebody else who couldn't make it tonight that would want to see it, that would be great. And we'll get that out also. And I think that is it. Let me check one more time here to see. Yeah, I think that's it. Well, everybody have a safe and happy evening and a great weekend, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you again.
Thanks again.